How did that journey lead you to Stanford as a home for your research and the work you're doing today?
This area of law and computer science has existed for a while, but they're still somewhat, I think I'd say distant cousins almost. We have a lot of researchers that have been interested in this space. They just never really overlapped in a neat way.
The emerging technologies and what people are getting excited about.
I think what's most exciting was then this sort of graduation into the first autonomous software engineer, so Devin, which really took the stage, and a lot of people were captivated by it. And yes, it's sort of built on top of GPT-4, but there was this new promise that you can have almost like a machine colleague.
Hey, I'm Kevin from Centauri, and I'm here with Dr. Megan Ma, who is Associate Director at Stanford CodeX. Very excited to have you on the show. Yeah. This is a conversation that we've been really looking forward to, and appreciate you making the time for it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin, for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Fantastic. So I think I'd love to kick things off by asking, what is your superhero origin story? How'd you go into this field? How'd you end up in the seat you're sitting in now?
It could end up being a supervillain story, but
Great, all right, supervillain origin story. Those are even more fun. So,
I guess it was totally random, to be honest. I started off, run-of-the-mill law school story, but I think I was actually in medical malpractice at some point, and I was really thinking about torts. And then at one point, I was doing a master's thesis on these new medical AI tools that were diagnosing, and they were, declaring that they had 92% accuracy. And what was interesting was that they weighed themselves against, human doctors. And they said against the Oxford trained or Harvard trained physicians, with 30 years of experience, that's 85% accuracy. We're way beyond them. And so I started to think, well, the big problem here isn't how accurate you are, actually. It's about A, how the patients would react to you, and B, even if they trust you, right? What happens if you get it wrong that other 8% of the time? And so I started to kind of think about, if it's just this narrow scope of medical AI, what about kind of the broader legal landscape? And so I ended up doing my PhD in that space and looking into how do you actually translate law into computer code.
Fascinating. That's a really exciting path. And how did that journey lead you to Stanford as a home for your research and the work you're doing today?
Yeah, so it's kind of this weird field that when I was doing it, it was this area of law and computer science has existed for a while, but they're still somewhat, I think I'd say distant cousins almost. We have a lot of researchers that have been interested in this space. They just never really overlapped in a neat way. And then the only research center that I had heard of that was doing remotely things that were in this space, especially the technology for law area, was CodeX, or Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. So I just applied, and here I am.
And truly, it's Stanford CodeX is a household name at this point in the space. So it's an institution that everyone's very excited about. And can you tell us a little more about the work that the research center does? So what are the main domains that CodeX covers, and what's the operation like there?
Yeah, so we always say that, so we're a joint initiative between law and computer science. We're actually housed at the law school, but we frequently have students from both CS and law. Some of the core areas that we focus on is computational law. There's also generative AI in legal practice. And I think there's other remote areas, such as we still touch upon other technologies like blockchain, for example. I think a lot of my focus, obviously, is thinking about integration of generative AI into legal practice. It comes from sort of a background in linguistics as well. So naturally, thinking about law and its linguistic medium of natural language, and how kind of over time it's moved from natural language processing into large language models. That's sort of my particular interest. The area of computational law is an area that I also did some work in. It was mostly understanding the explicit knowledge, and how do you formalize legal rules as computer code.
Very cool. So that's getting into the realm of those cross-disciplinary law and computer science. How do you see that crossover translating into the private sector? So when we think about law firms maybe specifically, but what trends are you seeing emerge in that crossover?
Yeah, when I first started, I heard a lot about this notion of a legal engineer, and I had still difficulty at the time grappling with what that meant. And honestly, it was the application of logic and, engineering skills to an extent, breaking things into tractable, bits and components, and kind of like treating legal problems as these types of solutions. And what's funny is that in the past, like the path that I've seen most common was like you'll do like something in humanities and social sciences and then go into law. And people are like, why did you go into law? Well, I wasn't so good at STEM.
Yeah, history major right here. So that's relatable. Yes.
And now I have like tons and tons of CS students and math students actually say like, I see a lot of interesting overlap and I want to go to law school after this. Sometimes they feel like it's taboo to even like mention that. And then folks that were in like, say, chemistry or biology and things like that, they had STEM backgrounds and went into law. They've kind of like fell neatly into patents and that space because they felt like, they could understand the inventor mindset. Now people just want to bring in the skills they learned from STEM into the legal field.
Oh, interesting. And what are some examples of that? Is it particular practice areas, particular clients that they're serving? What does that translate to?
Yeah, so it's, for me, I think what I see most commonly is that they end up in, say, knowledge management or something in that realm. Or you also see an interest in, doing transactions law, but you're much more like structured about the way that you tackle, how you get to the finish line in a particular deal.
That's cool. I think that's going to maybe help accelerate the world of deal making more broadly. And when you think about those knowledge management roles too, have you seen any? I mean, something I was reading recently was the explosion of data science as a field within large law firms, and firms are hiring more and more data scientists. Does that track with what you're seeing in your work at Stanford?
Absolutely. I mean, like we have some of our close partners like DLA Piper. They have a really kind of robust AI governance and risk team, which is composed of largely data scientists. Actually, they have a chief data scientist, one of the first non-loaders, so to speak, to become partner there. We also have, of course, Baker McKenzie. Danielle, she founded the Baker ML. It's clear that for a long time they started to think that these type of data insights were really crucial to the practice.
That's great. Yeah, both of those firms I think have really earned that reputation of being they build really cool stuff internally and have incredible teams they've constructed. So maybe related to this, you get exposure to at Stanford sort of the next generation of leaders in this space as they are being formed at the law school and in the CS department. What are you seeing in how they're thinking about this technology? They're going into the legal profession in a very quickly shifting time for the industry. What are some of the themes that you're hearing from them in the halls of the university?
It's funny because I think in the past, and maybe this is characteristic of just Stanford more broadly, I think entrepreneurship is a recurring theme now. And I feel like it's very much something that's not only in the past, just like, oh, some people have interest. It's almost like a lot of the law students have interest in this, or at least even a curiosity into it. In the past, it was like, well, one path, let's get pigeonholed into big law kind of thing. Yeah. But now it's like, I didn't realize that maybe I could start solving some of the pain points just listening to like in-house counsel or partners that Stanford brings in to teach. And so I'm pretty interested in seeing like what are the new careers that come out of law school, actually.
Interesting. Yeah. So not even the paths that we might not even be thinking about yet for these students.
Yeah, exactly.
That's super cool. Let's talk a little bit nuts and bolts of technology and some of the bleeding edge here. Hybrid models. What can you tell us about this emerging field?
Yeah, so there's always been kind of like when people discuss the AI winters, there's also like the specific type of AI winters. So there's like symbolic AI, and then there was an AI winter for it. Then there was neural AI, and then an AI winter for it. And it always seems like it was like two separate camps. But now what we're starting to see is people realizing that there's comparative advantage of each of these tools, and then they're kind of finding the relative strengths and merging how these tools are chained together. And so some of the examples that I see, so we have traditionally more of the camp of symbolic AI at CodeX, and it came in the form of computable contracts, which, for those who don't know, it's basically drawing out the logical form of a contract. And in doing that, you basically can use formal logic to compute, what are the gaps and overlaps in a contract. in different contracts, for example. So our classic example is in insurance, for example, where you can have multiple policies and you have to figure out, whether or not your car insurance and your credit card insurance, if you get into like a collision, sort of like what are you covered for respective to these different types of insurance.
Yeah, so like I got my credit card insurance, but I also have like the separate travel policy that I got.
Right.
Which one's going to cover the situation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the difficulty of computable contracts is that it's very expert and manual in order to translate a natural language contract, or what they call legacy contracts, into this computable form. For example, our own developers, when it was just him, it took 2 to 5 days to do one contract. And so you can imagine with like millions of contracts in circulation, it's just not tractable. And one thing we started to explore at our center is we built a translator actually using large language models. We basically took the methodology that our developer had used to translate a natural language contract into a computable contract and basically scaled it. We taught a model how to do that translation.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. What were some of the results of that? Did you see how did it perform?
Yeah, so basically the fidelity was pretty close to how, we teach our RAs and how we teach, other new developers that onboard with us, except rather than 2 to 5 days, it actually was anywhere between, 10 minutes to 30 minutes.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That right there is the future of where it's all going to.
Yeah.
Classic example of that manual process that would take multiple days of labor and now being accelerated into 10 minutes. That's awesome. But maybe touches on another point that's been a hot topic in legal tech right now is accuracy and retrieval augmented generation and the interplay there. And Stanford, I know this wasn't CodeX, but there was a well-publicized report at Stanford on the subject. What's your perspective on this? Where do you see opportunities for growth in the industry on benchmarking and accuracy and transparency between vendors perhaps and the end users?
So, that's a great question. So I guess there's two sort of separate thoughts. My first thought is that's sort of where hybrid models come in again, or some of the work that came out of Berkeley actually talked about something they called compound models, which is, how do you integrate some forms of logic into the actual large language model? So for us, we've seen a lot of emergence of using knowledge graphs rather than RAG, or using like knowledge graph RAG or something of the sort, or graph neural nets. And basically, it's like leveraging sort of the strengths of symbolic AI and needing that kind of reproducibility and scaling it using, large language models or kind of using it for knowledge retrieval. The other kind of path in general in terms of accuracy is, I think to an extent, hallucinations are an interesting fixation that the industry has, or actually most industries have kind of dove into. In the legal field, accuracy is pretty blurry. To be honest, I think accuracy, what we mean by it for the most part for lawyers, is it's a process of not only identifying what are the right facts, but also kind of synthesizing those facts into arguments. And so it's much less binary, in my opinion, than, how the medical field might say this is accurate or not accurate. And so this kind of fixation on hallucination per se can sometimes, to be honest, be a little bit of a red herring for me, because it kind of distracts away from the fact that the legal process of this research and this discovery, some of it prioritizes creativity. And it's not just, did I get the right case or not? You actually were formulating an argument and trying to identify what cases may or may not fit. And that to me is, the lines are just not clear enough to say hallucination is always the problem.
Interesting. That's I'll categorize that in the bucket of hot take. And I think that's really interesting. And I think one thing we've noticed on our side is working with firms, and we do, as you know, a lot of deal point extraction. So we help firms pull out data from documents. But what one attorney might categorize as the correct deal point might be different than the next attorney. Right. And a great example of that. Of course, some things are just subjective, dollar values and party names.
Right.
There's no debate over those. So maybe that leads us to the next question: AI agents. So where does that fit into the equation with the emerging technologies and what people are getting excited about? What's break that down for us.
Yeah, so I think the idea of AI agents started being exciting, knowing that you can kind of enumerate certain tasks and then have, basically a digital friend or a machine friend execute those tasks for you. And it kind of was like a natural lead in from a co-pilot, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that I think for many people, defining that task is the initial challenge. And so AI agents kind of did a great job for a while because it also integrated to a certain extent the planning and also the execution, because where humans have difficulty is articulating implicit knowledge or implicit actions and things like that. I think what's most exciting was then this sort of graduation into like the first autonomous software engineer, so Devin, which really like took the stage and a lot of people were captivated by it. And yes, it's sort of built on top of GPT-4, but there was this new promise that you can have almost like a machine colleague, which was bouncing ideas off of each other. And, I read on like, X or Twitter, this interesting post where someone like let Devin loose onto their own Slack and wanted to watch actually how it would interact with real human coworkers. Yeah. And it saw sort of a lot of humanity in it. And basically what they interpreted as that is the agent was willing to ask a lot of questions, whereas like with the models and doing the basic chat was much more directed, like this is a question, this is an answer. And here you're seeing a new evolution of like a lot more like interaction, a lot more planning, a lot more iteration, a lot more like changing directions even. And this dynamicism, this like emergence of new sort of machine social behavior, I think that is what's really interesting.
That's super interesting. So a related question. This is because we're in Silicon Valley right now, and Stanford, obviously in the heart of Silicon Valley. The famous experiment at Meta with Go, with the game of Go, and having, is that so I should first credit my co-founder Brian Davis, who was the first one who told me about that case study, and I just thought it was fascinating how truly seeing the models perform strategic maneuvers against human players, and the humans not knowing that they were playing against a machine. What does that look like in the context of law? Is that a near term? Is that far out sci-fi that we'll see a AI agent in law that is making strategic moves against an opponent? Is that in the very close future? Where do you see that heading?
Yeah, that is a great question. So Meta has been doing this work for quite a long time. Actually, I think the person that initially was doing not necessarily Go, but another, I think it was Risk or something like that. He built a model called Cicero. And then later on, I think he's now moved on to OpenAI, if I remember correctly. But in law specifically, what was particularly exciting for me and some of the work that we started to explore is multi-agent simulation. And I think even the area of simulation, right? The whole notion of being able to strategize and understand behavior better is very much like having a machine sparring partner, so to speak. And I think that we didn't really have that before. And some of the work that we've been manufacturing almost, or the analog version is, if I'm a transactions lawyer, I might go to my litigation partner to see if really my contract is that ironclad. And now you can kind of have a digital persona of that and kind of bounce off ideas and get like a different perspective.
Very interesting. What about let's negotiate a merger transaction with have the robots negotiate across from each other from end to end. Maybe that's the next evolution of this.
Right. So we have, we built an M&A negotiation simulator. And,
you actually did. So, okay, so that's very, I just threw that out there, but that's very on point.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's supposed to train like junior associates to catch the linguistic cues and strategy and draw it out and do that fact finding before you actually even sign an LOI. And so our tool is entirely built on behavior. And what was fascinating is that our next kind of iteration of it will have 2 autonomous agents so that someone could just watch different strategy played out.
Okay, so folks heard it here first. This is coming. this really, the AI agents are actually going to negotiate across each other. That's going to be really exciting. Yeah. I think that'll be a fun one for folks to keep an eye on. So a couple other questions on emerging technologies. We talked a little bit, I think, earlier about end users, maybe revisiting this subject. So when you look at the technologies being deployed into practice, who are the typical users of the cutting edge of AI in firms? Is it the partners? Is it the associates? Is it knowledge management? Is it all the above? What are you seeing in those conversations with your stakeholders?
So I think what's been really fascinating for us, and actually something that I just discovered today, is there seems to be a bit of a chasm between not only the decision makers, but actually those who are really using it and have embedded it into their process day to day. I think those who are obviously well seasoned, they're excited about the promise of this technology and can see the potential, but it takes some time to kind of unlearn certain skills that you're used to. It's almost like, when you first started to learn how to drive, right?
Yeah.
My parents would have like all their lazy practices and everything, but like you would be very careful to be like the 10 and 2.
Yes.
And I think it's the same thing where it's like the associates, they've gotten down the line and they're told like you have to use this tool. At least we're sandboxing this tool, so you need to practice it. And now we've heard actually from some law firms, some of these tools are indispensable to them. And
Right.
I think that was shocking to me, right? To hear that, because we mostly hear from the partner level most of the time. And, they're trying to understand where is the best part to integrate Gen AI. And if you had no prior experience and you're just exposed to the tools, then you're going to use it in whatever way makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's like has to be adopted into real workflows and
Right.
become that second nature technology in the same way that in the 90s, dictaphones,
Right.
pre email even. Very interesting. So we talked about some specific technologies that you're working on in areas of research. What do you get most excited about right now? So for folks that are, are wondering, for someone who's, at Stanford in the heart of where much of this innovation is happening, what is coming around the corner that you get really pumped about?
I think what's most exciting to me is almost we're at the cusp of changing how we teach law altogether. And it sounds, kind of far-fetched and abstract, but I think we've been teaching legal education, or law school has been stuck in the mindset of this, strain of philosophy, right? Like even in the way that you ask questions to lawyers, it's the Socratic method or law.
Yeah.
And so the Socratic method is from Socrates. So like we've been sort of viewing law in some level of jurisprudential, theoretical way. But more and more we're seeing students, and particularly those coming from STEM backgrounds, are saying, I need more of that practical skill. And I'm sure like even in law school for you, like you wanted the negotiation workshop. You wanted those hands-on things.
Those were super fun. That's
Right.
like, yeah.
You wanted to speak the language. You wanted to be a lawyer like early on. And, none of that really is explained during law school. And then you get a little bit of that disillusionment when you first enter practice. And it'd just be really nice if we were able to provide better glimpses of that, and we have the technology to do so now. So for me, it's quite a humanistic kind of excitement that I can start building these tools, or at least see these ideas and pivot how law school is going to be taught going forward.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's and I think maybe that some of the first beneficiaries of those will be the students in your own backyard right there at Stanford. So that's awesome. And I'm saying that as a Berkeley law grad, so like, I probably shouldn't say that, but I think Berkeley's also doing very cool stuff here too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go into a lightning round now. So a few fun questions. So maybe first, if you give some words of advice to young law students, what would you say as they're entering the profession right now?
I would say, honestly, step out of the law school. And if you have something of interest in a different area, just go for it.
Yeah, love that. Now, what's some a reading, a learning, or some experience you've recently had that's transformed your thinking or you found enlightening?
I think what was still pretty interesting for me is a paper that built off of generative agents, which was a viral paper about using large language models or foundation models to prompt and create a Sims-like environment. There was a new paper that came out called Agent Hospital, which basically used multi-agent simulation to test out how quickly patient recovery happens, depending on particular patterns in the medical space.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bring it back to the medical,
Yeah.
origin of the story.
Yeah.
That's great. A couple of fun ones. Favorite travel destination?
Paris, probably.
Paris. Great. Well, our mutual friend Alona, who is
Yes.
on the show, had the same answer. So good choice. And then here's a few this or that's. So a preference question. Vacation or staycation?
Currently staycation. I feel like I've been traveling a lot.
Great. Passenger or driver?
Passenger.
Passenger. Okay. Cruise or camping?
Cruise.
Cruise. Well, passenger or driver, I'm going to go back to them for a second. Are you a Californian as well?
No, I'm actually Canadian.
Canadian. Okay, so like we're seeing some regional tendencies here. Californians, like we grow up driving, basically got to drive everywhere. So, the freeway culture. So, which part of Canada?
I'm from Toronto.
Toronto, fantastic. Train or airplane?
This is a hard one. I think I'd say the train probably.
Train. Have you had any really memorable train rides or countries that you think have great train cultures?
So I mean, Europe is great in terms of trains. It's easy to get around to most countries with a train there, within Europe. And I think my favorite one is not really like cross country. It was between Florence to Venice. And I
Cool.
thought it was just this really short ride. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I'm going to these two incredibly famous cities. And it was like an hour away from each other.
They're just so
Yeah.
spoiled there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. All right, last one. PC or Mac?
Mac.
Mac. Good choice. All right. That's my preference as well, obviously. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ma, thank you so much for joining us. This was a great session and super enlightening. I hope our viewers had some interesting takeaways as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks.